Welcome, everyone, to this event. Welcome to this Visual Clave event. Very exciting. I'll give the microphone over to Professor Carlos Aguirre, who's the director of the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies, in just a second. But first of all, I would like to ask all of you to join me in acknowledging and honoring the fact that we are here on Kalapuya land. Thank you. Carlos?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Carlos Aguirre. I'm a professor of history and interim director for the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies. We're very glad to have with us Phil Scher and Pablo Iglesias, who will be having a conversation on visual clave, the expression of the Latino, Latina experience through album cover art, 1940, 1990. This presentation, as you probably know, is connected to the exhibit that you can see if you haven't at the gallery around the corner here in the museum. After the conversation, there will be live music. Stay for that. Dancing is welcome. Not obligatory, but welcome. The band Malanga will be playing. Phil Scher is professor of anthropology and folklore and public culture here at the U of O, and currently the divisional dean for social sciences. His research area is the Caribbean and Caribbean diaspora, with primary research interests in the politics of heritage and cultural identity, popular and public culture, tourism, and transnationalism. He's the author or co-editor of several books and has another one forthcoming titled An Economy of Souls, The Politics of Heritage and the Performance of Culture in a Neoliberal World. Pablo Iglesias is a Cuban-American artist, musician, writer, producer, and DJ based in Northampton, Massachusetts. He has designed, written, and produced liner notes for Latin music compilations released by various record labels, including very prominent ones, Fania, World Music Network, RMM, Capital Blue Note, and so forth. He's the author of Cocinando, 50 Years of Latin Album Cover Art, published in 2005 by Princeton Architectural Press. I also want to thank all the people that have made this event possible, especially Feather Crawford and Eli Mayer at Clave, and our wonderful Cheryl Hartup here at the museum. So please join me in welcoming Phil Scher and Pablo Iglesias. Thank you.
All right, I'm testing levels. How does this sound? Everything good? Yeah? Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. Thank you, Carlos, very much for that warm introduction. I do want to just take a second before we start. This show has been in the planning. Well, Pablo has been doing this show for a while, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the effort to bring this show here started a while ago. Let's see, when was Nixon in office? It seems like a long time. And none of it would at all be possible without Cheryl's. I would really appreciate if we could give Cheryl a big round of applause. And everyone here at the museum has just been absolutely phenomenal, so thank you. Pablo and I were asked to kind of do a talk, or Pablo had initially thought that he might do a talk, but we thought it might be better if it was more of a conversation that we can have, but also that we can have with you as well.
No, well, let's just turn our backs to them and
let's,
talk over here. Yeah.
We're going to turn off the mics and
like the old days.
have a little private conversation. So personally, just a little bit of background. I met Pablo in 1983 when he was my freshman roommate. Yeah.
Same here.
Yeah. I still owe you money from that first year. At the end of that first year, we decided to be roommates again.
Weird.
And I know, it worked out. And then,
Big mistake.
and then again. And then you finally threw me out, I think, junior year. Since that time, we've collaborated on all kinds of things.
Some which won't be mentioned.
We
here.
won't mention some of the collaborations. But this show, Pablo, as Carlos mentioned, is himself a practicing artist and is a producer and a DJ and a graphic designer and so many, many hats. This conversation, I hope today, will center around something that really began a long time ago, which was Pablo's passion for music and record collecting and all of the rest of it. We collected a lot of records at the same time back in the day when we were obsessed with vinyl. And I just kind of gave up, and Pablo just kept going. In, I want to say 2005, is that right?
Yeah.
Pablo published this book, which was just a lot of fun for me to look at, and really in some ways was the genesis of the show. And I'm going to let Pablo talk a lot more about that. So I'm going to just ask some questions about that, about his collecting, about the show. We'll hopefully get into it, and then we'll open it up for you all. How many of you have actually had a chance to wander through the gallery? And so I hope you come with some questions. There's some really intriguing pieces out there, and I'm sure Pablo will be happy to talk about them. So, turning to you now. Can you tell us a little bit about the origin? I know you were collecting for a while, but when did you first decide this might actually make for a good exhibition?
Well, I had seen these books about jazz album covers, rock album covers. You know, those have been out for many years, and even a few museum and gallery exhibitions. But it was always, you know, this sort of more mainstream, you know, American or European culture on display, or Jews, blues and jazz. Blacks and Jews. No, Jews and blues and jazz.
Jews and blaz.
Yeah, look at that. But basically nothing with Latin music or salsa or ranchera, Chicano music, what have you. I wasn't seeing any of that in books or certainly in exhibitions. And yet, in the United States, especially, but all over the world, you know, there's tons of Latin music out there and great designs. There were lots of books about the music itself, but not about the visual presentation of it, and how, you know, you could kind of get an idea of, through history, the presentation of the people and the cultures, you know, across the Latin diaspora, and so I just figured I better jump in there and take care of that hole, because it was upsetting me. You know, there's a sort of sense of injustice, like this needs to be addressed right now. But of course, it took a number of years to get that going. And I went to Princeton Architectural Press because they already had a book about the evolution of the album cover, because of course, I mean, now we're in this digital age where there's like no physicality to how you get your music if you don't want it. You know, you can just stream it. So if you don't want records, you don't want CDs, you don't even need a flash drive. You just, you know, have your device for playing it. So I thought, why not look at all of those different decades of how the music was presented, and see if I can do that. And these guys had a book about the evolution of the album cover and its first real designer, which was a guy named Alex Steinweiss, who worked with Columbia Records at the tail end of the '78 era, which we have, you know, in the show. This little thing here is hard to see, I know, but it's kind of one of the first covers you see when you go in, the Afro-Cuban music by Machito. That was a '78, and that was done at the tail end of the '78 era when they were starting to put covers on '78s. Before that, the '78 had 2 songs on it, and it was in like a brown paper sleeve. But they started putting them together into albums of more than 178, and they said, hey, we could sell these better if we had some artwork on it. So anyway, I contacted them because I said, you guys have this great book about Alex Steinweiss, and then they also had just put out one about 45s, the cover of a 7-inch 45, which seemed like more esoteric and rare than your typical, rock album cover books and Blue Note jazz book that was out. And I think I guilted them into it, maybe. I'm not sure. But they were like, yeah, we'll let you know. We'll think about that. I think they thought it was going to be just covers and no text, really, because that's kind of what their other books were, mainly about design. But to me, the most important aspect, aside from the visuals, was the stories behind it. And what does that mean in terms of identity politics and an evolution over the decades of who's controlling how the music is presented, in the case of Latin music. So I said, well, there's going to be a lot of text. Sorry about that, And that was a bit of a back and forth. But in the end, I think they were happy about it because it just was a story that hadn't been told before. So that's kind of how that got started.
So that actually kind of leads nicely to the next question I had. I've seen some of these compendia of rock album. I think we even have one in our house, and it could be, specific labels and their evolution of their album covers, or it's just rock album, iconic rock album covers. But the one thing that's interesting there, and the thing I noticed right away as you were kind of putting the themes together and telling us about how you wanted things laid out for this show, was there's this real sea change, if you will, in, you talked about moving from 78s and having actual artwork, but then there's another change, which is not just having artwork, but who's doing that work specifically. And you can see in this show, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about this pivot point, if you will, between who's doing the work, at what period, and when does it actually switch to being Latin artists themselves? And then there's a follow-up to that, which is how did you actually get to meet all of these? Because I know you've actually established relationships with a bunch of these artists, but we can talk about that in a minute. The first thing I want to just have you talk about, because one of the most interesting parts of the show to me is you can actually begin to see, I think, some real changes in the thematics. And can you tell us a little bit about when that starts to happen? What's the early history of the Latin music recording industry?
In the U.S.
In the U.S.
First of
exactly.
all,
In the U.S.
I can't speak for necessarily for other countries, but
and this is such a U.S. focused kind of a show. So
yeah.
What's happening in the 40s or so, and then how does it switch over, and when do these new labels arise?
Well, I mean, even though there were all along there were labels that were run by people of Hispanic, Latino, Latina descent or ethnicity, whatever you want to call it, from the early stages. The sort of big names like Tito Puente or as I was talking about, Machito, they were on these big labels like Columbia, RCA, and Decca and the like, which were, their purview was like the entirety of American popular music. They had a Latin division, but they had classical music or jazz, all these other concerns going at the same time. And they seem, after sort of reading about it and talking to some older musicians too, they seem to have this kind of patronizing control over things, of how they were presented. But that doesn't mean there weren't small independent labels, maybe even in the 40s and 50s, like Ansonia Records or Seco, that were in the community. But the sort of rising consciousness of how people were portrayed and the different themes, that really came with all the other social movements of civil rights and the 60s. And so Fania Records was established in the early 60s. There's Tico and Alegre, a couple of these other labels out of New York that had young designers and young musicians that were trying on new things. And so that's when I at least traced the kind of rising consciousness around them in the larger world as influencing how they were producing their covers and their music, really, too.
So not to put you too much on the spot, but if people were to leave here and go into the show, what would be a good example of pre and post sort of increased control of representation?
Well, I mean, towards the beginning of the show, because it's a little bit chronological, you can see there's another change too that happened, which was the way that the art could be reproduced or produced. You know, you see photography starting to come in, the old hand-done like illustrational style going. But if you were to look at any of the early album covers from the 50s, there's things like exoticism and kind of you know, heavy emphasis on sex and hotness, you know, just trying to sell this you know, cliched notion of what the music is. Not all covers are like that, but that's definitely, those were some of the aspects. If you go into the 70s with Fania Records, with any of the ones that are up there, you'll see there's a lot more layers going on where they're playing with some of those stereotypes, or they just have some straight out messages. You know, Eddie Palmieri's Justicia, I mean, it really says Justicia in these big sort of government jail type stencil lettering, and then in the upper corner you see Eddie's like, you know, grabbing his head, because he was very concerned with everything going on in the 60s and 70s affecting his community. So there's a big difference between like the Agua cover that has, even though all three people in the Agua cover were actually they were real members of the Latin music community at the time, you know, either dancers or musicians. But that setup there of like super striptease, you know, exploitative kind of thing, and then you compare that to something like Wanted by the FBI or Justicia. I mean, those are two different extremes, because Wanted by the FBI has humor in it if you look closer, right. But at the surface, it's kind of like gangster, you know, heavy duty looking, or Justicia that's really more of like a protest looking.
The other thing that strikes
cover.
me about the early albums from the 50s that are on that wall when you come in, you guys all see it when you go, is when it's sort of external or outsiders doing the representing, a lot of them seem to be set in clubs, right? In other words, this is music for consumption by outsiders. You know, this community is performing for you, whoever you might be. And when Latin artists begin taking over the kind of their own representation, the club thing kind of, it doesn't maybe entirely disappear, but they're sort of free to not just be on stage anymore. Now,
yeah, you see them more in their own environments. There's more of the cinema verite, gritty street thing, but it still ties in with Hollywood and TV, and certain negative stereotypes and portrayals of Latin communities. But yeah, definitely it comes out of the super theatrical and more into. There's, in addition to the realistic ones, though, there were a couple of designers that were really into pop art, psychedelic posters, you know, the Woodstock era comics, underground comics, and they like to use satire to kind of turn things around. So, I mean, there's no single style happening in the 60s and 70s. There's a lot of up for grabs, a lot going on. You know, and then also there was Latin music imported into the U.S. from South America, Mexico, Central America, other Caribbean countries, of course, and vice versa. The American stuff would go out, and we haven't talked about, you know, the West Coast, California, Texas, Chicano stuff, but some of the same movements are happening, obviously, there, both socially but also within the music industry. You know, where there were some more independent labels, and the artists were having more control over how they were presenting themselves. And you brought up something when we were talking before that I thought was interesting, this idea of syncretism, of this kind of mixture, which is the whole concept behind salsa being a mix of flavors, all coming together. And in a place like the United States, where you have so many different groups of people coming from different places, different origins, so that anything that you're going to produce is a hybrid. And to me, like, the most syncretic of all of it, really, that impacted everybody the most would be Santana, because on the face of it, yes, Carlos Santana, born in Mexico, first instrument was a mariachi violin, and then he translated that into the guitar crying, and that's very syncretic. But also just the fact that everybody else in his band was from different countries, and they were bringing in all these other influences, African, Afro-Cuban, rock, blues, etc. And then the fact that he wanted Matty Clarwine to do the album cover, to use his painting. And so he was kind of in control of how he was going to present this music. And if you look at that painting, which is not in the show, but is in the book, and everybody kind of knows that Santana album cover for Abraxas is what I'm talking about. And I think it's called the Annunciation. And it just has so many elements in it. I mean, it's just this whole mix of different religions, different kinds of people, different activities in that psychedelic melange, that was happening at that time. So to me, that's where the real renaissance in Latin music was happening, musically and visually. But we also have to note that there was so much more going on with theater, with social movements, with magazines. In terms of salsa, very important was Latin New York magazine, which in the 70s was run by Izzy Sanabria, who also was a designer, whose work is in the show. But he used the magazine for a lot of commentary about issues affecting his communities. And so there was so much going on. There was a TV show called Salsa. It's kind of like a Soul Train for salsa that Izzy was the MC for. So where's all this going? It's just to say that, that really was, to me, that's the most exciting time, especially the 70s. And that's kind of what I remember as a kid, hearing and seeing and getting into, sitting there staring at the designs while listening to the music. Maybe the radio's playing, whatever. But, it was very stimulating at that time.
I think that one of the things that came up in our conversations before was there's a kind of burden of representation. So in other words, there's a moment at which there's the opportunity to self-represent, and the artists find that opportunity, and the musicians encourage artists from their own community to participate in all that. And so there's this opportunity, but there's a bit of a burden as well. Some of it's represented by this sort of syncretic thing you're talking about. But part of it is also this tension between wanting to kind of show actually sort of who you are, what your community is like, and also needing to sell records or maybe cater to the expectation of the audience who are not from that community. And you sort of see that tension playing out a lot. There's no kind of, aha, we finally kind of seized control, and now we can, there's a lot of experimentation, it seems like, and some going back and forth. And one of the areas I want to talk about in terms of burden of representation, or where things are, worth really looking closely at, is representation of women in the show. Can you talk a little bit about how you thought about that section specifically?
Well, first of all, I really needed to counter these terrible album covers that have been literally like the whole time, since the LP started in the realm of Latin music, where you see this very exploitative eye, to the putting women on a cover to sell it to men, or I don't even know. It just was like millions of examples of those were out there, and I didn't want to put those in the book per se. There's still some that are close to exploitative, but there's this line between wanting to show the history of the sensuality and the liberation, especially in the 40s and 50s. It really, it's hard maybe to imagine just how repressed white America was at that time, and that places like a nightclub where you could go to dance mambo was one of the few places where everybody from all kinds of backgrounds could, be very sensual and enjoy themselves together, in this great environment. And so there is that aspect. But so yeah, I didn't want to. I'm not into like putting all of these women in bikinis in a book, obviously. That because so many of those albums are like that, and to this day, with CD covers or digital, and videos and stuff with reggaeton, it's just a lot of porno exploitation kind of stuff. And so yeah, I didn't want to get into that. But what I did want to show was that even though salsa, especially, is can be a very like macho, male-dominated genre, historically speaking, there were a number of very strong Latina artists, and they had a wide variety of covers representing them, from showing them with strength to exploiting them, So, but the ones that I chose were women that really mean a lot to me, and some of the covers that I thought were provocative or could spark some conversation, because there's no way that in any of the categories that I picked, that I wanted to like say this is what this genre, this grouping is about, the ghetto, or this is about women, or this is about dance, or this is about food. I really didn't want to talk too much. I wanted to just put them out there and let people, raise their own questions and think about them and that kind of thing. I have to say, there's a lot of markers, visual, cultural markers that you can see in these album covers, that if you are familiar with the cultures involved, you might understand on a different level. So, for instance, if you see La Lupe with a cigar, and she's looking like a modern 70s woman, in a pantsuit, and she's got the cigar, it might remind someone who is maybe not familiar with Afro-Cuban culture. You might think, it's like the Benson and Hedges, ad campaign of the 70s, like, I'm a liberated woman and I'm smoking my cigarette or something. Or, let's be provocative, and she's got a cigar. But to me, at the time, I know that she was deeply into Santeria, and that the tobacco was a sacred, sacrament for participating in it and in the Santeria ceremonies. And it's not that rare at all in Caribbean culture to see women with cigars. They roll them, they smoke them, they work in factories to roll them, they enjoy them. It's not a big deal. So there's a lot of secret subtext in these album covers, but I didn't want to like spell those things out. But I kind of put them in there just to kind of raise. I mean, she has even more explicit Santeria referencing images on some of her covers. Yeah. So that was kind of my thought behind the section of Strong Latinas, was just to say, yes, there are all these terrible exploitative covers out there. They could be demeaning. They could put people in a bad light. But here is a section that, to me, is a pretty good cross section of more positive portrayals of Latin women. So that was kind of what I was thinking about.
The cigar is a great example, and actually probably a great segue. I know, like, looking at La Lupe and thinking about Santeria and Vaudon, and thinking about when I had my shrine to El Agua, I was always told you have to blow cigar smoke over El Agua. So, and he is the kind of master of the crossroads, right? So, and opens the gate and all that. So, there's some really nice kind of evocative imagery and anything that refers to religion in that sense. But since a lot of these covers are there in order to kind of prompt questions, right? To have people look at them and go, I think this would be a good time to see if we have people in the audience who want to ask some questions of you, and probably ask some very more thoughtful questions than I can come up with. So I don't know, Cheryl, I'm happy to pass the Oh, we've got one. How exciting. Does anyone have a question for Pablo? Don't be shy. Well, here it comes. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. It's really interesting to listen to your conversation after seeing the show a couple of times. Wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the wooden cimarron sculpture that's there. I'm really intrigued in the lighting it on fire on the album covers. I'd just like to know more about that.
Thank you for that question. Yes, Charlie Rosario, who made that sculpture and then designed the album cover, and who was a good friend of the band, is the kind of guy that he makes me think of Frida Kahlo. He had a terrible accident as a kid, and he never would have had the opportunity really to go to art school if this accident hadn't happened. And that's a long story, but basically to deal with the pain, continual pain of his accident, when he was a kid, he got really into art because he was bedridden. And then eventually went to art school. And from there, he had these teachers, this is the late 60s, that really turned him on to all kinds of thinking outside of the box, you know? And he grew up in a very musical family, and so he was always very tied to his community, but he also had these art classes that sort of opened his eyes to the larger world of modern art around him. And so when he also did like the metal piece for the Larry Harlow thing, and a lot of other covers that were these kind of sculptural, you know, surprising ways of expressing what he felt about the music. So in that case, there's a literal story behind it, which was he was walking through Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and they had cut down a tree, and he and his cousin, who was a designer as well, each took home a log, a section of wood, and it sat there waiting for its purpose, kind of, you know. And then this band was formed, and the Cimarron concept, why they wanted it to be called that, was to honor the communities of escaped enslaved people that formed in every Caribbean and also in Colombia region. And he thought that he would carve some kind of, you know, African or native inspired work, but then because liberation and revolution can bring pain and can cause some kind of destruction, out of which hopefully something will then grow out of those ashes. He did a kind of performative thing, you know, where he lit on fire. He probably made some little video, took some pictures or whatever, and then, you know, that was kind of it. He said to himself, this is going to be great. This is going to put the type on it and boom, you know. And so I think that was because he would work very intuitively on most of the covers that were sculpture graphics, as he would call them. It's not like they were planned out so much ahead of time. They just kind of conglomerated around, you know, over time. So that's the story. It's kind of a tribal piece that then he lit on fire to do the cover.
Thank you very much for this interesting conversation. A couple of very quick questions. Was there any impact of the Cuban Revolution on the changes that you are chronicling in terms of, let's say, more politically explicit, not only covers, but also music in general? And the other one is, of course, most of the covers we are seeing represent people of mestizo and Afro background, not so many indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about Andean countries and Andean music being sold here. And even more specifically, I'm thinking about Ima Sumac, and whether that is also part of your study collection and so forth.
She's definitely in the book, I believe. I think I put one of those from the Exotica era, the voice of the Stabe, or however you say it. And she was amazing, quite something. And I've gotten more recently into a lot of Peruvian music of the 60s and 70s that was more tropical, and some of those album covers are amazing. And in terms of the indigenous being represented in Chicano music and Puerto Rican music, there are definitely good examples. Orquestra Borinquen, for instance, from Puerto Rico, has all of these Taino, images that come from the stone petroglyphs and those kind of things, but kind of reanimated, for these album covers in color paintings and that kind of thing. So it's true that I may not have that in the show, but it's definitely in my consciousness for sure.
You do have the Aztec, so it seems like there's
that's true, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually really good that you brought that up, because we're talking about when we're looking at the Latin music industry in the United States. Of course, it's a music of first or second or third generation people, some of whom may be nostalgic for a homeland, or they may not have really known it, and now they're just rediscovering it. And there's all kinds of notions of the things that we miss, like the food or the landscape, etc. So those might be evocative in the terms of the music and cover imagery. So for the Azteca and Malo album covers, we do see a sort of pop art sensibility deployed in depicting the sun calendar and the mythology of the Aztec king and his princess and the dying princess in the volcano. And so you're right, I forgot those are in the show. but whether or not those are really fully positive, or whether they're more just kind of pop art, it's a question. I don't know. It can go either way. I do believe that. Oh, and then there's a third one too, another Malo album cover that has it's a color painting of various indigenous people motifs. Forget what that album's called, but at any rate, so yeah, I'm sure that the musicians wanted to tie in with that pride, in their indigenous background, but it is a bit problematic because there's a certain kind of this kind of romanticized and nostalgic feel to some of it. But on the other hand, there's some humor. Like if you look closely at the Azteca album cover, the sundial, you see there's these instruments in there, piano, and so there's kind of more appropriation and taking it back, like saying, hey, these instruments can be ours too. We're taking this Western instrument of whatever, the saxophone or the piano or something, and we're making this melange of music that includes our indigenous roots and Afro roots and European roots, etc. So
there may also be, if you track some of that kind of, indigenous imagery, almost sometimes indigenous fetishization in a way, there may also be politically a way to kind of claim an aspect of the ancestry that is non-European specifically. You could be claiming that, especially in the Caribbean, you could be claiming Afro descent and Native or Amerindian descent as a way of kind of saying, I'm from this place, but I'm not really identifying with the European side of all of that. I'm kind of rejecting that to some degree. It actually, in some ways, makes me think of, this is not a band that comes up much in this show, but certainly a band that we were a fan of, which would be Redbone. You guys probably remember Redbone, and if you don't, you probably remember their big hit song, Come and Get Your Love, which was used in the opening of Guardians of the Galaxy. But Redbone, they're kind of mixed, but they used a lot of Native American, like North Native American imagery in all of their albums, and they were of mixed ancestry.
They were Chicano.
They were Chicano. So, but that's really interesting that they would lean toward Native American imagery in that sense, or indigeneity, as a different way of claiming a space. It seems like a historical and a cultural space. You had also asked about the impact of the Cuban Revolution.
Right. Yeah, I didn't include them here, not because I didn't want to, but just because we're trying to, like, you know, we have this specific space and we're trying to fit things in. But there are definitely visually references within salsa, for instance, to the notion that the revolution stood for of liberating, you know, this island and this people from a outside imperialist force, you know, European, let's say Spanish or American, United States. So, you know, there might be some musicians posing as revolutionaries on the cover. We do have in terms of the Mexican, you know, revolution, we have that. But they're also within salsa, visually, there are references. But in terms of what happened in Cuba is the sort of commercial element of the music was put aside, and it was no longer this kind of capitalist system, you know, for making the music and presenting the music. So all kinds of experimentation happened in Cuba. So you get these great album covers and amazing music that doesn't always have to worry about selling itself, doesn't always have to worry about playing along with other accepted advertising norms or you know, conventions and stuff. And, you know, I don't know that American designers, Latina designers in New York, let's say, whether they had access to really see some of what was going on there. But definitely the musicians eventually, even though there was the blockade, sometimes through other places like Venezuela, you know, these salsa bands would cover some of that music from after the revolution. Típica 73, for instance, the band that came out of another band, they were the backing band, some of them for Ray Barretto, and they heard some of this Cuban music happening through going to Venezuela, and they did their own salsa versions, and then eventually, I think it was in 77, or no, 79, they went to Cuba and they actually collaborated. Of course, they got into a lot of heat from your typical people like members of my family in Miami who were not happy about that collaboration. But it made for amazing music, and it was a great intercultural exchange. And it's funny because that album cover, for instance, from when they went down there, they're wearing these like classic Cuban rumba outfits, you know, with the big frilly sleeves and stuff, and you open it up inside and there's pictures of them going all over Cuba and interacting with all these people. So that must have had, you know, now after Buena Vista Social Club and everything else, we don't bat an eye at that kind of access and collaboration, but back then that was a big deal. So it did have, you know, between having some revolutionary-looking people on a cover that was more about, you know, trying to, for Puerto Rico, trying to liberate itself, you know, that there was inspiration there. And then in terms of musically, definitely there were some bands, you know. So, yeah, it happened, but just not on a big scale, probably.
Do we have other questions? There, and Joe.
How did Izzy Sanabria meet Salvador Dali? Do you know that?
He pursued Salvador Dali. You know, when Izzy was growing up, this is what happens to a lot of people of Hispanic or Latina descent in, let's say, in his case, in New York. You don't have a lot of role models, that people that look or sound like you when you're growing up in the 50s, right? In high school or what have you. So in art class, you're learning about, you know, all of these, you know, artists that don't really jive with your community. But then he was exposed to the Spanish painters, Velázquez, etc. And but Dali was the one that really grabbed him, and spoke to him with the surrealist imagery. And by the time he did meet him, he was connected enough to all kinds of performance things and art openings and stuff. And I don't remember the specific way, other than I'm pretty sure he just pursued him. He went to something that he was doing, that Dali, the picture that you guys found, that I think was an event that Dali was doing. And Izzy brought his little magazine crew with him to document it in case it worked out, take the picture of them together. And there was a T-shirt concept involved, and it was kind of just one of, Izzy was full of all of these marketing ideas. His background was in advertising, graphic design and advertising, and the whole wanted by the FBI thing was one of his stunts, So in the case of meeting Salvador Dali, I'm pretty sure he pursued him. So he just wanted to meet his hero, kind of thing.
We had another question.
Yeah, I think.
Right.
I'm curious as to how often controversy over cover art was met with censorship, and like what the artists and the labels themselves did, or at least would say about it, and perhaps like some examples of the relevant era.
So do you mean like when a designer or a band wanted to have a certain cover and then somebody tried to censor them?
Correct. You kind of touched on how a lot of the some of the was too exploitive, possibly, or whether it was touching on something else, and I'm guessing maybe something had to be censored.
Well, definitely the one by the FBI. The FBI did not like the fact that it said FBI on there. So after, and they really weren't aware of salsa, I would think, other than maybe trying to infiltrate it for their little, trying to check out if there's any more revolutionaries around. But basically, once they got wind of it, they said, well, you can't appropriate this wanted poster. It was actually, it was a Black Panther, I think, that was the original wanted poster that Izzy, took and altered. And so they said, well, the next batch that you print, you have to take the FBI part. So it just said wanted on it. But in terms of a cover being too controversial in terms of taste, I mean, no, there's some really bad salsa covers out there, and I don't think they self-censored that way. I do know there was controversy around some of the depictions of fantasy and sci-fi and more like gringo rock and roll imagery for some of the salsa bands, most famous being Sonora Ponceña, that started out with a very traditional sound. They were sonoras, they had the trumpets and just very like classic Cuban based, and they were from Ponce in Puerto Rico, a very important city for music. And their first album covers were either pictures of the band or very Puerto Rican, very like pulling at your heartstrings of pride and culture. And then all of a sudden, this guy, Ron Levine, comes in from outside, from the rock and roll world, and he does these fantasy covers, with like some kind of robot riding on a horse through outer space, or a guy with a lightsaber, or Conan the Barbarian type guy. But it's still salsa,
I think of Puerto Rico when I think of robot horsemen.
So, like, the example in here is, this guy playing an organ for the Johnny Ortiz album. But if you look closely, there's a little conga drum in there, and it's kind of a Caribbean setting, So he was getting that in there. Other people, though, said that they didn't have a problem at all with this depiction, because why can't you use any kind of imagery? Why does it have to be always, pride in our culture, everything specific to, these certain tropes, these things that you use over and over again to signify typical, like music of the people? Why not bring in these other elements. And indeed, Fania Records was always trying to kind of cross over and get as many people into their product as possible, you know, by making movies and stuff as well as albums. So the connection there was actually from, goes back to Woodstock, because Michael Lang, who was the impresario that started Woodstock, was friends with Jerry Masucci, one half of Fania Records. And Jerry said, I want this guy that's designing a lot of stuff for you, all your rock and soul albums and stuff, because Michael Lang had a record label too, Just Sunshine. And, you know, bringing that rock and psychedelic youth element into selling Latin music. So that was kind of, you know, where that came from was a kind of commercial, you know, desire to get across to the rest of American youth, you know, about Latin music on their own visual terms. So
I think it kind of brings us back to the concept that we talked about of the burden of representation. You know, where are you constrained if you are always in a position? I mean, I've talked about this a little bit with Caribbean artists. The point at which you go, okay, well, why does everything we have? I mean, Caribbean artists say this to me all the time. You know, like, I get a little bit tired of everything I do has to come out somehow like reference where I'm from. I don't mind some of it,
or like
you know,
a betterment for the race kind of a thing.
right? But I guess it could bring you back to the comment about Santana, where I mean, there's a person who's, you know, in the kind of pantheon of rock guitarists and is connected with Woodstock and connected with, you know, in some ways maybe more with that than with like Latin American music, and was somewhat unfettered in a way in the album covers he could use and in the styles he could inhabit and all the rest of that stuff. But still, you know, you can hear in his playing, you can hear in some of this songwriting, and in some of the, you know, there's often a kind of a nod, you know, to the thing that he's connected to kind of culturally. We're almost out of time, but I want to make sure that anybody who has a question has a chance to ask it in the waning moments of our talk. Yeah.
Yes, it's no accident that it's 1940 to 90 because, as you pointed out at the outset of your talk, people receive or hear their music in much different way. So with the advent of particularly the compact disc, album covers were not, shall we say, the same size. They got downsized or miniaturized. So I wonder if you could say a few words about that historical phenomenon and perhaps maybe that as a factor now in the small vinyl renaissance we have going on now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point.
We were joking about it, like with the advent of the CD case, not only was the artwork really small and pretty unsatisfying, but there were no more big double gatefold albums to clean your weed with. You know? So, not that that would ever be a thing for me. My friends complained.
Yeah, no, it's true though, because and now weed is getting illegal, so, and the records are coming back. Weird, huh?
Oh yeah. Is there a correlation?
I don't know.
We
man.
might as well.
I don't
We've
know.
legalized marijuana. We might as well bring back the album.
We did already,
Yeah.
so it's good. Okay, no, but I want to say, just to speak to the, on the one hand, it's kind of zen and amazing that, you know, the physicality of music has been shrunk down to like nothing if you want it to be. Like if you really want to clean house and just not deal with stuff, that's kind of an amazing thing that you can still get music delivered to you, you know, without having to be a materialist. But I'm old school. I never left vinyl. I've always loved it. It's a piece of art. It's a piece of, you know, popular culture, you know, shrunk down to this window that you can look into. history and art and people with. So to me, it's really important. And yeah, I mean, I cut it off in 1990. Seems maybe kind of arbitrary because yes, there's still great album cover art and LPs and CD covers in Latin music afterwards. But you have to kind of cut it somewhere. And my friend Cecilia Noel's crazy cover where she's giving birth to the trumpet, that's 1989. So that was kind of my cutoff for the show. It was like, oh shoot, that's not from the 70s. I better, bring it up to include hers because I really need to include her cover. So that's kind of why it ended then. And I put out records myself, and artwork is really important, and some of them are Latin. And so there's definitely some great art out there now, but that kind of becomes a whole other show, and I was just hoping to kind of trace this evolution and consciousness coming to the fore. The other thing I want to say quickly too is obviously the way that we design as designers has changed. It's gotten digital too. So what I love about the work, most of the work in this show is all hand done. From the fonts and the actual shapes to the photography, et cetera. I mean, now it's completely different and has been since Quark, and then InDesign really changed everything. So in the old days, everything was pasted and airbrushed, and you couldn't make a lot of changes either. So it's amazing what they did do with what they had, you know what I mean, in those days. And sometimes, to think more about the other question of censorship, it was too late. There was not a lot of changes that could happen with a cover in those days, unlike today when you can keep tweaking things. And back then, it literally was the concept of the designer or the art director, and maybe a musician had input, and you better hope that it works because you're not really going to get another chance, to play with it. So,
well, thanks to everyone for coming out this afternoon, and to Pablo for coming all the way from Massachusetts, and to Margot for coming too, and to Cheryl and the whole JSMA team. And I hope that everyone gets a chance, if you haven't been through the show, to go through it. But I assume a lot of you already have. It's up until when?
21st, something like that.
It's up for a while. In a few days, we're gonna turn all the albums over so you can read the backs. Now, I think
Music.
Is it now?
Now, yes.
So yes, the
Thank
music
you.
will be.
Thanks again.
Okay, you're giving museum crowds that reputation, so you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that the dance floor gets better. All right, we're going to do an old school rumba. Ahí vamos, tiempo de España. Tiempo de España. Lentito, lentito.
You look really happy sitting down. You're standing up.
A big hand for all those involved in the exhibit. Thanks to Pablo being out here, coming out, making sure.
Beautiful exhibit.
Cheryl always hides in the back. You gotta give her a applause. Everyone else involved in the museum, Phil, everybody else in the planning is here. Hope you're enjoying it. We are Malanga, and we are going to do actually a song that I believe is on one of the album covers out there. This is Cheche Cole, Willy Colon. Yeah, of course. Goes with us. But only one was on English. That's right. Thank you, thank you. This is a little gem from Panama. Via Colombia, via Puerto Rico, via... Bonito swing, vamos. Save it, save it. Somebody writes songs at 6. I know, they both begin with 2. finish up here with a tune that you may have heard in a couple different fashions. We're going to do it the Afro-Peruvian way. Toro Mata. So get your 6 groove on.